Aelia Capitolina, 333. A Christian pilgrim has arrived in the city once known long ago as Jerusalem. He's come a very long way, all the way from Bordeaux, on the opposite end of the Roman Empire. And not only has he come seeking religion, but profit, for he intends to sell the record of his journey as a guidebook for fellow pilgrims, a guidebook that will survive into the modern era. The Bordeaux Pilgrim describes what he sees atop the Temple Mount. The grand bronze statues of Hadrian and Antoninus Pius still tower over the western wall, though now they have lost their paint jobs, and the pilgrim can't even tell them apart. But the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus is long gone. Indeed, all traces of paganism in the city have disappeared, banished from sight by a new emperor. Not far from the statues, the pilgrim says, there is a perforated stone to which the Jews come every year and anoint it, bewail themselves with groans, rend their garments, and so depart. That stone is the foundation stone, the pinnacle of the Temple Mount around which once stood the Holy of Holies. The man who anoints the stone is he who would have been the high priest. The other worshippers stand beneath the western wall, so as not to risk stepping inside the space where the temple sanctuary had once been. That day is Tisha B'Av, and it is the only day on which the Jewish people can enter their own city. By the time of Judah Hanassi's death, he had been personally honored and given large estates throughout Palestine by Emperor Caracalla, who had been a friend of the Jews since childhood. But despite his kindness, Palestine's woes only escalated during the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of political assassinations, civil wars, Persian and Germanic invasions, and economic ruin that really should have destroyed the Roman Empire. During this period, the total population of the province declined from nearly 4 million to fewer than 1 million. Not even the natural landscape could benefit from this decline. After a century under the poor stewardship of Roman landlords, deforestation in the Judean mountains reached a tipping point, and as the denuded soil began to blow away, the once fertile terraces of old Judea became barren wastes. So too did the region lose its ancestral language. Although the kingdom of Judea had used Aramaic and Greek as its official languages, Hebrew still held on as the common tongue in the area immediately surrounding Jerusalem. But Hadrian's genocide following the Bar Kokhba revolt had culled a huge proportion of its native speakers, and by the end of the 3rd century, it lived on only as the language of religion. But there is one entity that was unquestionably buoyed by the crisis: Christianity. As the institutions of the Roman state failed, Christian churches rushed in to fill the gap. By 301, 10% of the Roman population was Christian, and neighboring Armenia had even adopted Christianity as the official state religion. This general trend culminated in the rise of Rome's new order, the Dominate. At the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian had attempted to stabilize the empire by dividing it between multiple rulers, in what became known as the Tetrarchy. But while this did make the Roman state more defensible from outside threats, it also served to fuel decades of civil war, which were won in 312 by Emperor Constantine. Before his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had dreamed that painting Chi Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ, on his soldiers' shields, would enable him to win the war. And as a result of his triumph, Constantine ended Rome's persecution of Christians. He even began supporting them. But Constantine's embrace of Christianity raised a lot of uncomfortable questions about the religion. Questions like, what exactly does the church believe in? Is there one church? Should there be? And what is the exact nature of Christ? But one of the most consequential issues in Christianity arose precisely as a result of the fact that Christian bishops had drafted Constantine himself to arbitrate these disputes. What did it mean for Christianity that its chief arbiter was the same seat of power that had authorized Jesus' crucifixion? At least from the time of Julius Caesar, it was traditional to disproportionately blame foreign allies for the outbreaks of civil wars, as it was far easier and more tasteful to celebrate the defeat of non-Romans. This attitude, combined with pre-existing Roman anti-Semitism, persuaded early Christian writers to demonize the Jews rather than Rome for Jesus' crucifixion. In 1 Thessalonians, the Apostle Paul appears to condemn the Jews collectively and eternally for Jesus' execution. He even analogizes Jesus' execution to the execution of all Jewish prophets, something which has no basis whatsoever in the Old Testament. I say that he appears to do this because the passage explicitly contradicts other statements by Paul in his epistle to the Romans, leading scholars to suspect that this passage was a later addition, probably written during the 3rd century crisis, probably by a Gentile who had never read the Hebrew Bible. But the passage was very popular, as appealing to widespread Roman distaste for the Jewish people was much more effective as a recruitment tool, and this was an attitude that Constantine himself thoroughly embraced, as he explained when disconnecting the date of Easter from that of Passover. Let us then have nothing in common with the Jews, who are our adversaries. For how can they entertain right views on any point who, after having compassed the death of the Lord, being out of their minds, are guided not by sound reason, but by an unrestrained passion, wherever their innate madness carries them, lest your pure minds should appear to share in the customs of a people so utterly depraved. Under Constantine's edicts, Jewish converts to Christianity could never return to Judaism, and anyone who tried to dissuade or prevent a Jew from converting to Christianity was to be burned at the stake. It was around this point that Christians began to outnumber Jews in Palestine. However, even Constantine did not allow violence against Jews for its own sake. The same could not be said for the policies of his son, Constantius II. In a single generation, Rome went from persecuting all Christians to persecuting all non-Christians, sanctioning violent raids on Jewish communities in Palestine and authorizing the destruction of synagogues. But Constantius was not all-powerful. Until 350, he was only emperor in the east, and when his brother Constans was usurped in the west, Constantius went to war, leaving his cousin Gallus as Caesar of the east. Between Gallus's appointment on the 15th of March and his arrival at Antioch on the 7th of May, 351, the Great Sanhedrin, whose leaders had inveighed against Constantius's wrath, declared war. Sensing Roman weakness in the turmoil, a member of the Sanhedrin named Isaac led a raid on the Roman garrison in his hometown of Caesarea, formerly Sepphoris. The Romans panicked and fled, leaving behind enough weapons to begin a proper rebellion. Isaac thus joined forces with a messianic claimant named Patricius Natrona, and together they conquered the Galilee and the Sharon plain as far south as Diospolis, formerly Lydda. This rebellion was short-lived. In 352, Gallus dispatched the general Ursinus to defeat the Jews. Isaac and Patricius were killed in the fighting, the city of Caesarea was completely destroyed, and thousands of rebels were executed, including some children. Ultimately, the Jewish revolt against Gallus was the shortest and least bloody of the 5 Jewish-Roman wars. While the Roman state continued to authorize public violence against Jews, there was no mass recrimination or ethnic cleansing of the kind instituted by Hadrian. In fact, it was not until 358 that the revolt would take its final and greatest casualty, the Great Sanhedrin. In light of the Sanhedrin's abolition, the Nasi Hillel the Younger organized a secret final meeting in 358. Together, this last Sanhedrin would implement one of the most important institutions in Judaism. For all of its history up to this point, Judaism had relied on an empirical calendar. Each year was divided evenly into 12 months that lined up with lunar phases. Because the phases of the moon don't line up with the solar year, the Great Sanhedrin would occasionally add an extra month in the late winter to keep up with the seasons and all-important agricultural cycles. But without a Sanhedrin, this ad hoc adjustment would no longer be possible. To be absolutely clear, the Sanhedrin had not intended to wait until the last possible moment to do this. For centuries, rabbis had dreamed of transitioning to an automated calendar, such as that devised by Julius Caesar. But Judaism had a major complication that the Julian calendar couldn't deal with. Shabbat, the period from Friday night to Saturday afternoon, is the Jewish day of rest, on which all work is prohibited. But it's far more strict than its Christian or Muslim equivalents. For our purposes today, the most important thing is that Jews could not cook meals on Shabbat, which interfered with the ability to observe the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the Jewish Day of Atonement, on which Jews must fast for 25 hours to purge themselves of the previous year's sins. If Yom Kippur fell the day before Shabbat, people wouldn't be able to feed themselves for an additional 24 hours, And if Yom Kippur fell the day after Shabbat, people wouldn't be able to cook a meal before beginning their fast. The Sanhedrin thus had to come up with a calendar that would prevent the Day of Atonement from ever falling on a Friday or a Sunday. Now at this point, we need to acknowledge that Persia exists. While the Sanhedrin had been futzing around the Galilee, a rabbi named Judah ben Ezekiel had established a prestigious new Jewish academy at Pumbedita, near what is now Fallujah. The legal arguments of Pumbedita and other Mesopotamian schools would eventually be compiled into the Babylonian Gemara, which would soon after that be combined with the Mishnah and the Jerusalem Gemara to form the Talmud. And it was a delegation of these Eastern rabbis who provided a solution to the calendar. Back in Mesopotamia, non-Jews still used the ancient Babylonian calendar, which managed to align the lunar and solar cycles by adding an additional month to 7 out of every 19 years. This would be the template for the new Hebrew calendar. Doing some basic math, Hillel the Younger realized that Yom Kippur could avoid Fridays and Sundays entirely by placing the necessary leap months on the 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th years of the Babylonian cycle. Although it would take about 400 years to become universally adopted, the Hebrew calendar obviated the need for any central authority to regulate the Jewish religion. This was a monumental achievement, without which Judaism probably wouldn't have survived. With the calendar completed, the Sanhedrin sent out its last batch of messengers to tell the world what they had done, said a prayer of thanksgiving, and dispersed, never to meet again. Or so they thought. 4 years later, Hillel the Younger received an invitation to meet with several prominent rabbis from the diaspora at Antioch. There, he and his contemporaries were greeted by none other than the Roman emperor. His message to the rabbis: rebuild the temple. Rebuild the temple immediately. The fate of the empire depends on it. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonim level patrons Lev Ham and Vicky Nelson. If you like this and want to support the channel, you too can become a patron on Patreon, linked in the description below. You can also find links to my sources for this video in the description, as well as a link to my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.